Awakening and to the remarkable time in the early 19th century when American religion really was revived and renewed, and church membership expanded, and a whole new commitment to the cause of Christ in American churches. And beginning what some historians have called the evangelical empire in America. It really was a time of evangelical success, of evangelical service, of churches being committed to foreign missions, to home missions, to educational projects, to all sorts of efforts at social reform. Americans became great at organizing societies to accomplish specific tasks. There were anti-dueling societies. There were anti-Freemason societies. There were rescue missions. There were anti-prostitution societies. Increasingly, as the 19th century went on, there were anti-alcohol societies. It's very interesting to watch the American Protestant attitude towards alcohol. Down to the years between 1810 and 1820, American Protestants were largely committed to moderate use of alcohol. They were opposed to drunkenness. But somewhere in that decade, between 1810 and 1820, the whole attitude of the evangelical Protestant movement shifted to be completely anti-alcohol. And that was the moment at which American Protestantism, in the vast majority of cases, there were exceptions, the Dutch, the Germans, there were a few who refused to give up their alcohol, but the vast majority of American Protestants turned absolutely against alcohol. It's a little hard to figure out exactly why that happened or why it happened so comprehensively. My suspicion is that as the church moved west, the only alcohol available on the frontier was whiskey. There wasn't much beer, there wasn't much wine, and that whiskey was drunk, it was probably bad whiskey, and it was drunk just for the effect, and the churches were upset about the drunkenness and, of course, the products of drunkenness, laziness, abuse in families, all sorts of problems. But there are all these commitments that began to arise in specialized societies to promote what was seen as social good. Anti-slavery societies emerged in the early 19th century as well. So there is this interesting development of very vital religion, very committed on the one hand to evangelism, but also very committed to social improvement. How are we going to make America a more righteous place, a holier place, a place where all sorts of social ills are done away with? At the same time, an interesting phenomenon that develops is this very democratized Christianity. The people are in control. One of the great books on this subject is Nathan Hatch's book, The Democratization of American Christianity. And what he traces in that book is that one of the effects of this growing sense of democracy was a growing suspicion of experts. And I think that has continued with Americans to a certain extent. You know, in Germany in the 19th century, if you said a professor says, everyone would say, well, that must be true and that must be what we have to do. In America, if you say a professor says, the response is, so what? I mean, what would he know? What difference does it make that he thinks he's an expert? Americans have a sort of settled anti-expert sense, and that really emerges in the early 19th century. There was a revolt against experts in the law. Now, people have always hated lawyers, so that wasn't all that new, but there was this sense not only that we didn't like lawyers, but they don't even know what they're doing. We can do without lawyers. There was also a great revolt against doctors. We can medicate ourselves. Now, in the early 19th century, the doctors actually didn't know that much, and you probably were almost as safe without a doctor as with a doctor, but it gave rise to health food movements. Post and Kellogg developed cereals to make you healthy, and Graham developed a flour to make graham crackers to make you healthy. There was all sorts of experimentation with health foods as a revolt against the doctors as experts. Well, that same thing affected the church. There was a revolt against educated ministers and theologians. Who needs them? Isn't the Bible a plain book? Isn't the Bible a book we can all understand? What do you need theologians for? What do you need educated ministers for? And so this democratization of religion led to a kind of revolt against experts, a revolt against authority, and the emergence of this strong sense that the laity can understand the Bible on their own and therefore can make important decisions about religions. And all of this then fed into this awakening, this growing awakening that produced any number of prominent preachers, some of them very local, some of them regional, some of them having a nationwide influence, and those preachers came from different theological backgrounds. There was one preacher during this early 19th century period by the name of Asahel Nettleton. That's a great name, isn't it? I'll leave you to spell Asahel on your own, a good Old Testament name. Asahel Nettleton was really quite a Calvinistic preacher, and yet was very effective in preaching far and wide, bringing people to conversion, planting churches. So we need to keep in mind that Nettleton, who was quite famous in his own day, represented that continuing tradition of Calvinistic preachers and evangelists and church builders that were still influential in the early 19th century. But theirs was not the only voice in the early 19th century. The churches also saw some other influences emerging. Another important and somewhat transitional figure of this period was a preacher by the name of Lyman Beecher. And Lyman Beecher had been born and educated in Connecticut, was sort of part of the old order, the old established order of the churches in Connecticut. He was born in 1775. But then he developed over time. He moved out of that parish system. He would finally move way out west to Ohio. And in 1835 would publish a very influential book from Cincinnati entitled A Plea for the West. And it was an interesting statement about his conviction that the West would shape the future of the country. It was crucial that the West should have the best young preachers in the country to go out and ensure that schools would be built, that the Sabbath would be sanctified, that Roman Catholicism would be opposed. A good bit of the book is the danger of Roman Catholicism. And Lyman Beecher started out as a fairly Calvinist teacher in the congregational churches. He would later become a Presbyterian. But over time, he became convinced that the great danger facing America was, on the one hand, Unitarianism, and on the other hand, Roman Catholicism. And the differences amongst Protestants in between should be sort of overlooked. And that the great need was revival to stop the Unitarians and stop the Roman Catholics. And Beecher had a huge influence because of his education, his background, his prominence, and he would produce two children who would be very famous in America. His daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, would write probably the most influential American book of the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and would really galvanize sentiment in America against slavery. I recommended that book to a friend years ago, and she read it and she said, "I hated that book. You didn't warn me I needed 2 boxes of Kleenex to read it." It still is a very emotional, impactful book that was a great opposition to slavery. His son, Henry Ward Beecher, in the second half of the 19th century, would become one of the most famous preachers in America, and a preacher who really did kind of begin to dabble in liberal theology and move the churches somewhat away from a faithfully biblical point of view. But But Lyman Beecher was very influential in his own day. Again, a figure somewhat forgotten in our day. And the really famous theologian of the Second Awakening is neither Asahel Nettleton nor Lyman Beecher, but Charles Grandison Finney. Finney certainly was not the only preacher, and some have argued that in his heyday, Nettleton was actually a more influential preacher. But the preacher who really put his stamp on that period of history and remained an influence well beyond his own day certainly was Charles Grandison Finney. And so we want to spend a little bit of time thinking about Finney because of his influence, because of the mark he made. He was born in 1792 and lived all the way down to 1875. So he had a long life, an influential life through the 19th century. He was born and raised in New York, and was originally a lawyer. He always had a kind of legal mind, well organized. He was a very bright fellow, but had never been extensively educated in theology. He never went to school to study theology. And I always find that a great comfort, that it's not just seminaries that corrupt theologians. They can get corrupted on their own. They don't need help. And Finney really was tutored for a while in theology by a minister who had led to his conversion, a Presbyterian minister. He then became a Presbyterian minister working in Western New York. Actually, Finney was first born in Connecticut, but grew up in New York. And I want to get all this exactly right because I don't want to get in any trouble with any of you. He labored in the part of New York which would later produce Joseph Smith and William Miller, two very influential figures. Joseph Smith, the father of Mormonism, William Miller having an important impact on the rise of Seventh-day Adventism. So this is a part of New York that would later be called the burnt-over district. So much religion would take place in that part of Western New York. The Oneida community, a utopian community, would develop there. That this burnt-over district had all of these intense religious emotions there, and Finney very much participated in them. Finney concluded with his lawyer-like mind that we need a streamlined theology so that we can preach more effectively and get through to people. The important thing, Finney concluded as time developed, is getting through to people. Education is a waste of time. Dignity. I'm sure he had plenty of Presbyterians come up to him and say, "You're not very dignified for a Presbyterian minister." And he said, "Dignity, that's just the language of the devil." Finney didn't have use for anything that interfered in his mind with what would get through to people and change people and turn them around. And that's why he became this very famous, dominant figure, not only because he was an effective preacher, but also because he became a pretty effective propagandist for his cause. He was not only a preacher, but he was a writer, and he would eventually write and publish his lectures on the revival of religion, which was a pretty big book, about 500 pages on how to have a revival and how to promote revivals. And that came out in the 1830s and has been in print ever since. Never has gone out of print as a book that continues to be an influential book in American thought. And what was surprising in Finney's book on revivals is his contention that if you want a revival, you can have a revival. This was a brand new way of thinking, completely at odds with the Great Awakening, completely at odds with the Calvinistic view of the revival of religion. Calvinists said a revival is a miraculous supernatural work of the Holy Spirit coming at the will of God, not at the will of man. We can pray for it, we can work for it, we can wait for it, but we can't cause it. And Finney comes along and says, that's absolutely wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. We can have a revival whenever we faithfully use the means of grace that God has appointed. There is nothing miraculous, there is nothing supernatural about a revival. A revival is scientific, he said. And here we begin to see how the broad world of the 19th century in which he was operating is beginning to influence him. So Finney is arguing that a revival is not a supernatural work of God, but it is simply a faithful work of men. And he said, part of the faithful work you have to do to have a revival is to pray in faith that God will give you a revival. And if you pray in faith, God always answers your prayer. Now, what's significant is we're beginning to hear a variety of ideas that will be developed later very extensively in American religion. The prayer of faith will give you what you want. Revival is scientific, not supernatural. And all of these things are elements that find their roots, if not their whole development, later in Finney, and develop later in other thinkers and other churches. What's interesting is Finney's thoroughness. Now, he said, now some people may say, well, didn't Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane pray in faith that this cup would pass from him? He said, I hear that all the time from people, that Jesus prayed the prayer of faith, but he didn't get what he prayed for. So the prayer of faith doesn't always give you what you pray for. He said, that just is misunderstanding the Bible. Jesus in Gethsemane prayed that he might not die in Gethsemane. And he didn't. So the prayer of faith was answered. This is what you might call not the most impressive exegesis that is going on. But Finney was very thoughtful. He would later publish a systematic theology. One of the most ghastly systematic theologies ever published. In seminary, I make students read 200 pages of that systematic theology just because I think if I summarize it, people won't believe how bad it is. My own favorite part of the systematic theology is he begins by saying, the Westminster Confession is worse than the Pope. This by a fellow who'd been a Presbyterian minister. He left the Presbyterian church to become a Congregationalist to avoid being put on trial in the church. He said, at least the Pope dies, and you can get a new one. But the Westminster Confession of Faith never dies. He then goes on to develop his thought, which is that we have to save ourselves. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Finney is one of the most consistent Pelagians in the history of the church. There may be a little grace to help, but you don't really need it. You have the ability to turn to God, and he writes in his systematic theology, anybody who teaches that we are saved by the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ received by faith alone preaches another gospel. And to that I say, amen. It is another gospel from the one that Charles Finney preached. It happens to be the biblical gospel, but it shows how really radical Finney's thought was. In his systematic theology, now he wrote this later in life. He wrote this in the 1840s. It isn't what he always preached. But he wrote in that systematic theology that in order to be saved, you have to be entirely consecrated to Christ. You have to have achieved sinless perfection. How are you all doing? I mean, it's really quite remarkable, the standard he sets and the vision he has of Christianity. Most people, of course, then and now, don't read his systematic theology. It was not what he was most known for. But it shows how the underlying approach of Finney was so radically different from the Reformation, from the Great Awakening, from historic Protestant theology. Nevertheless, because he was really almost a propagandist for his own cause, he also wrote an autobiography that sold very widely, telling people what a wonderful success he was and how much the Lord had used him, and a lot of people believed that. He then contributes to what I call the apostolic tradition of evangelists in America. There has been a tendency in a number of Protestant circles in America to look at American church history and say, God has always raised up a key evangelist in every generation. And so you have George Whitefield, the great evangelist of the middle of the 18th century. And then you have Finney as the great evangelist of the first half of the 19th century. And then you have Dwight L. Moody emerging in the second half of the 19th century. And then you have Billy Sunday coming after Dwight L. Moody. And after Dwight L. Moody, after Billy Sunday, comes Billy Graham. And there are people who really feel you can trace the essential faithfulness and spirituality of the American church by tracing these great evangelists. Of course, they don't pause to ask who sort of comes between Billy Sunday, who dies in 1935, and Billy Graham, who doesn't really emerge for a decade later. Well, I'll try to argue with you in the next series on church history that it's clearly Aimee Semple McPherson. Come on, we're going to have fun with Aimee when we get there. I like Aimee a lot. But there is this sort of notion that American Protestantism, American revivalism exists in light of these great evangelists. If you go to the Billy Graham Center, Wheaton College, there's a museum there, and in that museum, prominently displayed, Whitefield, Finney, Moody, Sunday, Graham. There's this sense of apostolic in quotes, apostolic succession. So Finney is this very prominent individual who puts a huge stamp on American revivalism, turning it much more Arminian, although Arminius would have been really offended by Finney's theology, turning it much more, still quite theological because he does all of this writing, but particularly introducing what come to be known as new measures. And that was what was most controversial in Finney's own early ministry. It's interesting, it wasn't, first of all, his theology that was so controversial, although it became more controversial over time. But first of all, what was really controversial were the new measures, the methodology that he introduced to accomplish his purpose. And this methodology issue was significant because it seemed undignified to many people. But Finney said very clearly, God accomplishes his work through excitement. If we're going to have religion survive, there has to be excitement. Excitement is central to the advance of religion. And I think American churches far and wide have listened to Finney ever since. And we're forever looking for excitement. And Finney himself said, you can't have excitement if you don't have something new. Always something new. Because the same old thing never remains exciting. To be exciting, you need something new. And Finney was the beginner of religious manipulation, of religious technology to get things exciting and new. Well, we need to stop there, but next time we'll go on with Finney and look at those new measures and see what a profound impact they had on the development of American religion. Thank you.
2, Lyman Beecher believed Roman Catholicism and blank were the greatest threats to American religion. So what did he think it was? Seventh-day Adventism, Jehovah's Witness, Unitarianism, or Mormonism? Unitarianism. Yeah, Unitarianism tracks back to the Jewish one God, and the Unitarians deny the deity of Christ, and totally, total Arian mess, and they got such a foothold. They came from Europe, came from Poland and Transylvania, so vampire Unitarians. But there was that skewed faith developed in Europe and then worked its way over to the United States. Number 3, which influential figures did the burned over district of Western New York produce? So you've got Joseph Smith, William Miller, Charles Finney, or all of the above. What do you like? All. Yeah, you got. And it's interesting that just this is New York, upstate New York, and you've got all these crazy things coming out of this small area.
Why did they call it the burned over district?
Why they call it burned over? They had another word for it as well, but I guess it's just, I don't know, just like all these different faiths like spring up, like fires, forest fires. I don't know. I'd have to look that up and figure out why they call that.
It's because Western New York had so much religious activity and fervency that it was known as the burned over district.
Yeah, so activity and fervency. But I don't know why the actual literal words burned over. But we can try to figure that out for ourselves. Excuse me? I think so as well, yeah.
Either that was on the pit of hell.
Okay, Charles Finney, number 4. He was able to communicate effectively because of his education in theology. True or false? False. Right. He was educated as a lawyer, had no theological training. 5. Charles Finney is one of the most consistent blanks in church history. Is he a preterist, a Socinian, a Nestorian, or a Pelagian? Pelagian, right, yeah. Dr. Godfrey pointed that out. And 6, the idea that the faithfulness of the American church is evident by a line of faithful evangelists is called the blank of evangelists in America. So is it the apostolic succession, apostolic tradition, apostolic lineage, or apostolic seed? Remember what the second word would be?
Tradition.
Tradition, yeah. Yeah, this chain of people. So I think he's gonna talk more about that in the next 12 lessons after we're finished with these. So you might have to wait a year or so to find out. Okay, so we have these discussion questions here. The first one talks about the democratization of Christianity, and that led to this distrust of expert authorities. And what are some of the dangers of a distrust of expert authority? What's a danger? How do you know what's true? So you have an uncertainty about truth. Yeah? What's another danger?
It's always a moving standard, because you have to question your authority by some authority.
Okay, so you're always trying to pin down what authority helps you identify authority. consider in his life, what could be some reasons that his theology strayed so far?
Lack of education in theology.
Excuse me?
Lack of education in theology.
Okay, he had a lack of theological education, so he could have strayed and not even known he was straying to some extent. That's a possibility. Any other reasons?
He was an entertainer.
He was an entertainer. Yeah. That comment he made at the end about excitement. We have to have excitement, or we should, Finney said we should have excitement and always something new in the churches. Well, just, look at how a lot of our evangelical churches are going today. It's showtime. We're addicted to entertainment. I saw a video clip about the peak of the Holy Spirit's activity in a church. And in this church, that should be from Dave in the pulpit. Dave speaking to us as bringing the message of God to us. That should be the peak. But what do you think the peak was in the evangelical church? It was right in the middle of the music. Yeah, so it was some chorus they sang 15 or 20 times over, and people got all worked up and excited by that. So you've got this excitement that he brings, and that kind of leads into the next question: what ways did he preach a different gospel? Yeah, Dave, loud for me.
Can I add one more element that I think is part of why he deviated from the truth? I think that's his pride. When you think about his autobiography that was cited by Dr. Godfrey, how it was just all about him.
Oh, good point. Yeah,
And I think that's the factor.
his personal glory. Yeah. Okay, and then the similarity. What's the main similarity between Finney's beliefs about how to bring about revival and Arminian theology? What's the similarity there?
Your own words.
You're going to say man. I see it coming. Yeah. It's man-centered. Man does it. It's a word. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's do a little deep dive into things. So we tapped on Unitarianism. I'm not going to spend any more time on Finney because that's next week. But what about Ashael Nettleton? He was highly influential. He was a Calvinist minister, and the estimate of the number of people he converted to Christianity was, one biographer said it was about 30,000 souls converted to Christianity. And he was active in this time in the early 1800s, and he along with Lyman Beecher, opposed the teachings of Finney. Now he started off he was born in 1783 in Connecticut, and he would have religious impressions, he said. Here's a quote from him. "One evening while standing alone in a field, we watched the sun go down. The approaching night reminded me that my own life would someday fade into the darkness of the world beyond. I suddenly realized that I, like all other people, would die." So this is one of his religious impressions. And he becomes converted in 1802 and becomes very interested in missions, and he has a strong desire to become a missionary to the heathen. And the interesting thing about America at this time is the heathen were just next door, that you didn't have to go very far west to get to people that need to have a missionary. He was a Congregationalist. He led Congregationalist revivals in New England. He liked 2 plugs.